one of the arguments against the Prophet Muhammad, and one of the arguments against the Quran, is that the Quran denies that the Prophet Muhammad could perform miracles. Now, this is false because if you read those verses that Christian missionaries or Christian critics of Islam bring up, or atheist critics or whatever, bring up, the verses of the Quran are not denying that the Prophet Muhammad can never do miracles. The verses that those critics bring up is just those verses are denying specific miracles to specific people. So the Quran is basically the reason why the Quran is denying specific miracles to specific disbelievers, or the disbelievers of Mecca, etc., is because even if Prophet Muhammad does those miracles, they still wouldn't believe. So that's the whole point of the Quran denying specific miracles to those specific people. Now, if you read the Gospels, if you read the Gospel of Mark and if you read the Gospel of Matthew, now notice in the Gospel of Mark what Jesus says. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 11 to 13, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven. Jesus sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." And if you read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12 and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, Jesus says, the Pharisees ask Jesus to do a miracle or a sign from heaven, and he says, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. No sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12 and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16. So basically, the same logic applies with the Quran is basically saying the same thing. The same logic applies with the Quran. The Quran is denying specific miracles, just like Jesus was denying specific miracles, or Jesus was denying miracles to the Pharisees. The Quran is denying miracles to the disbelievers because because those people were evil people, they were evil and wicked people, evil or adulterous people, according to Jesus, and those people still wouldn't believe even if they got those miracles. So that was the whole point of the Quran denying those miracles, just like Jesus was denying miracles to the Pharisees. Uh, so if you read those verses in context, or if you read the verses of the Quran, and if you read their historical contexts, or you read the commentaries on the Quran, the commentary of Al-Tabari, the commentary of Al-Qurtubi, commentary of Ibn Kathir, etc., etc., it was the Quran is quoting what the disbelievers are saying. The Quran itself is not saying this. Uh, you know, so that was the whole point. But the whole point is that the Quran, nowhere in the Quran does it say Prophet Muhammad can never do miracles. It was just denying specific miracles to specific people. But anyways, now Sam Shamoon brought this up in my debate or discussion or whatever you want to call those things, whatever you want to call that discussion I had with him. He was bringing this up. He said that the Quran denies the Prophet Muhammad did miracles, and that the Hadith came 200 years later, and these are later legends. That's completely false. First of all, the Hadith did not come 200 years later. The Hadith were written by the disciples or the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and they were passed on from one generation to the second generation. And the second point is that Shamoon, see, this is the problem with these critics of Islam. They don't read the commentaries, or they don't read the context of those verses. If you read the commentaries, Tafsir ibn Kathir, Tafsir ibn Abbas, Tafsir al-Tabari, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, basically the commentary of al-Tabari, the commentary of al-Qurtubi, their commentaries on the Quran, these classical Muslim scholars, the whole historical context to those verses was denying miracles to specific disbelievers because, like Jesus said, these people are evil and adulterous people to begin with, and there's no point in doing those miracles because even if they get those miracles, they're still not going to believe in Muhammad. They're still not going to believe in Jesus, right? They're going to keep asking for signs over and over and over again. So the reason why Jesus refuses to give miracles is because his miracles are not for the sake of convincing hardened or hardened unbelievers, but they are to show the power of God in the context of mercy. Same thing with the Quran. Or same thing with what the Quran is saying. The Quran is refusing specific miracles because these are not the miracles are not for the sake of convincing hardened unbelievers. Just like Jesus was denying those miracles or refusing those miracles because it's not the point is not to do those miracles to convince, hardened or evil disbelievers. So, and then Shamoun brought up the Quran, chapter 29, verse 48 to 51. But, notice how he didn't give any historical context to that verse. If you read Tafsir Ibn, or I'm sorry, if you read Tafsir of Al-Tabari and Tafsir Al-Qurtubi, the Quran, chapter 29, verse 51, was talking about a different situation. It wasn't talking about those same people that the Quran was denying miracles to. Uh, the verse in question is, what? Is it not sufficient for them that we have sent down the Quran to be recited to them? So Shamoun is basically saying, well, the Quran's the only miracle. The Quran says that the Quran is the only miracle, and that's false. Because now notice what the verse says. It says, "Is it not enough for them?" The Quran is not saying the Quran is the only miracle, or the Quran is not saying you ask for miracles and the Quran is the only miracle you're going to get. The Quran is not saying the Quran is the only miracle. The Quran is just saying this Quran is enough to be a miracle. And if you read Tafsir al-Jalalain on the Quran, chapter 29, verse 51, it's basically saying that the Quran is an ongoing miracle, and that these miracles that Jesus did and Moses did, etc., were temporary miracles, only meant for the people of that time. So the Quran is basically saying that the Quran is enough miracle, as in the Quran will last forever. And that's true. People memorize the Quran, and you can see the prophecies of the Quran come true, and other objective reasons to believe in the Quran. So that's basically what it's saying. But this shows that Shamoun, see, the problem with these critics of Islam is they take things out of context and they try to spin their own interpretations of the Quran. If you read the commentaries, Tafsir ibn Kathir, Tafsir ibn Abbas, etc., the commentaries are basically showing or saying why Allah didn't give those miracles to those people was because they were never going to believe to begin with. The Quran is not saying that the Prophet Muhammad can never do miracles. The Quran is denying specific miracles to specific people, just like Jesus was denying or was refusing to do miracles to the Pharisees because he knew that wasn't the point of miracles. The point of miracles wasn't to convince, evil and adulterous people, like Jesus says. The point was to show the power of God in through his vessels being Jesus and Muhammad. So if they say, well, the Quran denies the Prophet Muhammad did miracles, this is false, because if you read those verses carefully, it's quoting the disbelievers, or it's refusing miracles to the disbelievers. The Quran itself is not denying that the Prophet Muhammad cannot do miracles. So basically, the Quran needs to be read in its historical context. And if you read the commentaries of Ibn Abbas, Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, etc., you can understand, you can see the historical context of those verses that were just denying those miracles to those people. But even if you read the Quran, chapter 54, that the Prophet would split the moon in half and put it back together. So the Quran is basically saying this is one of the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad, splitting the moon in half in front of the pagan Meccans, and putting it back together. So this is just my quick response to that whole argument. 1 second here. Let me see if I can just pull up the. So if they say that, well, the Quran chapter 29 verse 51 is saying, well, the Quran is the only miracle of the Prophet Muhammad, that's not true, because if you read that verse. All it says is that the Quran is basically saying the Quran is enough. The Quran is enough for you. That means the Quran is enough for the Meccans, but it's not the only miracle. Uh, you know, uh, the Quran is not saying, well, the Quran is not saying this is the you ask for miracles and you get no miracle, but the Quran or the Quran is not saying the Quran is the only miracle. It was just saying is the Quran not enough for the Meccans? Just the Quran, the Quran being a enough miracle is not the Quran is not saying the Quran is the only miracle that you get. So, if you read those verses that they keep citing over and over, it's just quoting what the disbelievers are saying. The Quran itself is not saying that the Prophet Muhammad can't do miracles. So the conclusion here is that the Quran's logic is the same as Jesus's logic. No signs will be given to an evil and adulterous nation. As Jesus says, and the same thing with the Quran. The Quran is saying no miracles will be given to these evil disbelievers because God knows they're not going to believe if they get those miracles, and that's not the point of miracles. The point of miracles is not just to entertain people and just to convince evil and hardened people. The point of miracles is to help people strengthen their faith, not convince evil people of prophethood. So this is the logic of Jesus, and this is the logic of the Quran. Stay tuned. More videos coming up.